To be able to build accessible healthcare systems in this century, you need to be able to enable innovators to bring cutting-edge software and AI applications to patients, to users, safely at scale. And it's not just about like making things faster. It's about making sure that the safe technologies get to the right people as fast as possible. It needs to be safe and it needs to be effective, and otherwise you lose trust and the adoption of the technology slows down. So the way that we see ourselves is we're a piece of global healthcare infrastructure, if you will, where we enable customers to be able to not just bring their products safely to patients, but also can iterate on them.
Hey, really, this week I'm joined by another James Dewar, and he is Scarlett CEO and co-founder. Did a master's in AI machine learning from Imperial, worked as a data scientist, met a guy called Jamie. So, Jamie, and James interviewing. Spent nearly 4 years developing Scarlett, now into Europe's only software and AI specialized notified body. If you don't know what that is, we'll cover it. They basically certify medical software under the MDR. Again, we'll go over all of these sort of acronyms and things, although I'm sure most of you know. But yeah, they do it more efficiently and frequently than anyone else, apparently. But I'm sure we'll hear it from you, James. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Very well. Business end of my wife's pregnancy now, so I'm stealing a bit of time to come and do this podcast in between building an obscene amount of furniture, which seems to be all I do at the minute. But yeah, that's what's going on for me.
Are you trying to cram in as much work as possible before the due date? Have you entered that danger zone where it's
I don't know, man. You're a CEO. In fact, well, here we go. You're a CEO. I feel like my life's, or because my life's work seems to be constantly trying to reduce my workload and then sort of grow the business enough so I can hire myself out of certain jobs. So my entire work life is trying to do less work, and I seem to be doing so much work to try and do less work. So I'm in a constant state of this will never be finished. And I heard it on a podcast the other day, you're going to die with things on your to-do list. I was like, that's very true, because I'm constantly just trying to work incredibly hard to reduce the amount of work I do, which is a fool's errand. So
it is.
I'm in a strange headspace right now.
I like leverage is the name of the game. But I do think that you have to kind of have confidence that you've solved the problems the right way in order to then be able to leverage yourself and to be able to find somebody who's even more talented in that area and to take it further. And I think that you have to strike that balance of when to leverage yourself by finding somebody who's even more talented to be able to take that on versus that being too early or too late.
Yeah, more talented in the area is interesting. That's an interesting point, because this is again something that I'm struggling with conceptually and practically, because we're bootstrapped, right? And so we are. There's always this thing of we're trying to do things in a different way. We're trying to innovate everything that we go into. And that's not kind of I'm not trying to say that in a grandiose way as if I know better, but it's the way that PR companies have been built previously is not the way that Somex is built, in the sense of the things that we value in content, PR, design, multimedia, all that stuff is very different. And so even in that, I'm struggling to find the person that holds the same values, that's got some health and tech experience and some investor startup experience and some communications expertise. So I'm actually finding it really difficult to sort of do that whole, hire super smart people and get out of their way, because I would love that. I'd absolutely love that. But then there was that whole founder mode thing. And I know the founder of Airbnb talks about this, of actually he skips a load of levels to work with the juniors to get something how he wants it. And then he disappears back out and lets it come back up the chain in the right way. So all this super interesting stuff. But oh man, if you've managed to hire good people and get out of their way, all credit to you.
I think you have to. Otherwise you end up being the blocker towards progress for the business and for what you're trying to for the mission. I find that generally we always hire on attitude over aptitude. And what I mean by that is I think obviously we hire very talented people, but I think that people with the right attitude will be able to upskill, or for example hiring somebody who has experience, legal experience or communication experience, but hasn't necessarily worked in healthcare or in health techs. if they have the right mindset and if they have the right attitude, people can learn the ins and out of the industry. There are some, it is, and maybe in some ways a little bit slower, maybe in terms of the onboarding, but I found that very marginal compared to the to the benefits that you get. So I feel like that's one place where we've hired a lot of people who have spent extensive parts of their career in health tech, including Jamie and I. But I think that it's the right people with the right mindset who are mission driven will also upskill, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll get into it, man. So, pleasure to have you on. Obviously, seen a lot of what you guys are up to, the things that you're doing. Again, doing things slightly differently. A notified body that doesn't look like other notified bodies. But yeah, before we get into that and all the stuff around regulatory, and I promise for listeners, we're going to make regulatory interesting. It will be interesting.
It is interesting.
And it is interesting. And it is interesting. That's what I should have said. It is interesting. Yeah, give us your story, mate. So how, AI stuff at Imperial, computer science, all this sort of stuff. Like how does that kind of technical affiliation and nature then turn into regulatory and entrepreneurship as well? So yeah, give us the full story.
I think the a good place to, or the relevant part, let's put it that way, of picking up my kind of life story or professional life story is probably when I studied computer science, and then I did a master's in ML and AI at Imperial. And I think the turning point is when I picked my dissertation topic, and there what I was doing was I was applying reinforcement learning to the treatment of sepsis in intensive care units. And so the idea was to be able to develop better algorithms to be able to detect early onsets, so you could treat it, because obviously it's very, far better than I do, but is obviously a very acute and very fast moving condition. And so I did my master's thesis on that, and collaborated with a guy called Matthew Komorowski, who I think now is actually has spun up a kind of a health tech as well. So he was a anesthetist, and actually at that point I'd heard through a mutual connection about this company called Babylon, and actually but they said they didn't have a job for me at that point. And so actually I went, and obviously kind of at that point my parents are like, okay, it's been years and years of studying, you need to get a job, you need to kind of pay your own rent at some point. And so I got a job at a company called Smarkets, which is not in the healthcare industry, maybe in a very different industry, which is the sports betting industry. And it's a slightly different and I think more interesting betting company, because they are what's called a betting exchange. So they're more akin to like a financial exchange, but you can buy and sell outcomes of sporting events or political events. And so it's more of a financial kind of type of institution rather than a kind of traditional bookie. And over there I was like a quant. So I was like building algorithms to be able to trade on the exchange. And it was a role that was very technologically interesting, worked with brilliant people. But I think that after a year and a half, like the impact of my work, and like obviously working, you commit a lot of your time, your personal time to working in your life. And for me to work on something that was impactful and meaningful is important. And just solving purely technical challenges, although interesting, doesn't really drive me. And so then I kind of applied again to Babylon. This time they had a role for me, and I joined in the symptom tracker team. And so this is a product. Part of Babylon's products was one of them was this kind of AI symptom tracker. So you'd speak to you have this automated conversation with an AI, and at the end it would diagnose you and triage you. And that's on that team that I met my co-founder Jamie. We're not even just both Jamies. We're both Jameses, and our middle name is Alexander for both of us. So we're both James Alexanders. So that's where we met. We're working together on that team, and he studied medicine and then became a software engineer, and perhaps maybe much to his parents' chagrin, and I was a data scientist. And I think that that's where we obviously started working on AI applications in healthcare, but also that's when we kind of encountered the challenge around so that piece of that application, symptom tracker, is a medical device, and back then it was a kind of class 1 medical device under MDD. This is pre the Brexit law changes in the UK, and but it was a kind of classic software medical device application that's kind of class 1 under the old regulation and class 2A under the new regulations. And so we had to kind of submit an application to be able to get certification for that. And I think that the challenges that we faced were around, the time it takes to be able to bring that technology to market safely, but also we were quite throttled in our ability to release changes to that product once it was regulated. And as people who build software and any software in any industry, it's very, very core to be able to build good software that you are able to change it frequently. And it's very fundamental to that technology. And I think that the processes that we went through were much more built for hardware devices than they were built for software devices. And I think the fundamental difference that we saw between those two is, hardware doesn't really need to change, right? Like you build a piece of hardware, it gets approved, and then it becomes much more of a commercial exercise of how many syringes or plasters can I commercialize, and that's very different to the way that people build software. People build software where they want to kind of get a version out, and then they need feedback from users to be able to then improve it and change it, and that's fundamentally how you climb the hill of improving software. But also, especially in the case of AI, where people want to be able to retrain their model on new data gathered in real world contexts, and retrain their model and reship them. And those are the challenges that we experienced ourselves. The kind of classic startup, like, experience the pain, and then left to start Scarlet.
Awesome. So let's run through Scarlet. Let's run through just quickly, and then we'll come back to some of your background stuff. But let's just cover off some of these terms for the people that might not understand them, and let's just talk about the regulatory landscape. So just lay the land of what was the problems, why Scarlet was a good idea, and lay that out for us.
Yeah. So I think on the problem side, I think that the core challenge is the differences that I think a lot of the notified bodies, who are very, very capable and very capable organizations, but I think a lot of them are what's called full scope notified bodies. And so they'll do a lot of them have approval for all kinds of devices, active devices, non-active, implantables, non-implantables, some that use human tissue, some who don't. So there's all kinds of, there's dozens of them. And I think that the way that those, and so what that means that a lot of the processes they have to build are, obviously they're very successful businesses, but they've built those in a way that is, quite different from the way that software is built. And so that was kind of the point I was making before. And what we see and what we believe is, and Scarlet is a very mission-driven organization, is that, we believe that to be able to, provide accessible health, to be able to build accessible healthcare systems in this century, you don't need to kind of train more doctors or ask doctors to work longer hours or make policy changes. I think you need to be able to to enable innovators to bring cutting edge software and AI applications to patients, to users, safely at scale. And that's really the problem that Scarlet solves. And so the way that we see ourselves is we're a piece of global healthcare infrastructure, if you will, where we enable customers to be able to not just bring their products safely to patients, but can also iterate on them, right? So to be able to, and I think another thing as well is, like, maybe you've seen over your time some pitch decks of health tech companies, but there's always a slide around, like, market size, right? And generally that market sizing is like a multiplication of how many people have this condition, how many people have diabetes, how many people have something, and then multiplied by how much people will be willing to pay for the service. And but obviously those people, the kind of the asterisk that nobody talks about there is the fact that, like, those people are everywhere. and so those companies need to be able to access those people in order to be able to deliver their innovation. And so today we're excited to be able to enable any company in the world who's building software and AI medical devices can use Scarlet to go through assessments, and if they comply with the requirements, access the European or the UK market. And there are some also EEA countries there. So I think Turkey and Iceland and Norway are kind of countries that I think fall as well within, and Switzerland, for example, kind of fall with the recognized EU MDR approvals. So I think you can access somewhere around 500 to 600 million people. But obviously there are there are other people out there, and so I think that it's always interesting to think about how can we enable technology to be able to be brought to as many people as possible.
It's a heck of a bottleneck at the minute, isn't it? notified bodies, people wanting to get things approved. There's so much in the way of ideas turning into reality, and people wanting to bring things to market, people wanting to sell things, people wanting to pilot things, people wanting to, get on the path to get that scale. And God, yeah, it's a heck of a bottleneck.
I think that the thing I'd say there is it's a nuanced bottleneck, right? Because I think Scott's one of the very few companies, like other notified bodies, that kind of sit on the other side, right? And so we're regulated by the UK government, we're regulated by the European Commission to do what we do, and I think that it is a bottleneck, and it is but it's what I would say, having now been doing it is and having approved our first device and have a whole bunch of other ones in the pipeline is it's also complicated, right? And I think that we're very excited to be able to build a process and experience for companies that is more intuitive, and that is more that essentially really helps to focus the question when it comes to the assessment, or to be able to focus on the really valuable questions. Because I'll give you a story. Is when we were back at Babylon, I remember we were shipping a change to the symptom tracker, and I remember one of the clinicians was, because there's quite a lot of clinicians on our team, and one of the clinicians was doing some testing, but that testing wasn't part of the test results that they wanted to be able to include in the release notes and in the regulatory release. And I asked them, I said, why are you doing this additional testing on the side, kind of in nights and weekends on this change that we're making? And I remember she said, look, I feel at the moment that the data that we're sharing and the way that we're sharing the data to with our notified body isn't actually impacting isn't necessarily improving the safety of the device. But me as a clinician, I obviously want to make sure from an ethical and moral perspective that what I'm shipping is obviously safe and effective. And it's interesting because that person went kind of out of their way to be able to go and test the product in to do their kind of own kind of bespoke testing, just more for their peace of mind, if you will.
Their own integrity, I guess.
Exactly. And I think that's interesting because part of me is I think that if we lived in a world where there's no medical device regulation and it was kind of a caveat emptor world where it's kind of buy and beware, I think that people would still be testing and verifying the product that they're building before they put them out there, right? And I think that that's the kind of and I think that the experience that we want to be able to provide with Scarlett is how close to that can we get, right? How close can we get to the world where people can provide the data they need to provide effectively? A lot of the administration, of which there's quite a lot around the assessment, can be made better and more consistent with the help of software, and then you can have the clinician, which there will always be a human in the loop, but you can have our clinical experts or software experts or AI experts really have their interesting, meaningful conversations that actually the manufacturer wants to have, right? So we've had feedbacks from some of our customers, appreciating interesting conversations and debates that we've had about certain aspects of their product and the safety and the performance of that product. And I think that that's actually where a lot of value creation happens for our customers beyond just getting to market, which obviously is very important.
Well, and just value for the sector, isn't it? Because the overwhelming frustration of people trying to go through this is that when it's not fit for purpose, or it doesn't feel fit for purpose, it feels like you're wasting time jumping through hoops, all of these, red tape, all of this comes from that frustration. Whereas if it feels more meaningful going through it, then of course you can be far more aligned. It's interesting as well that you talk about the people that are on the side that want to regulate, and they themselves want to make sure that certain questions around this are answered, and so they are, you're right, for their own peace of mind and or for their own integrity, want to do that. So it's almost like a duty, isn't it, that if you do sit in the middle of these two things, that actually if we're going to move the space forwards, that whole assessment needs to be agile in itself. It needs to have an element of learning and adaptability and listening and making sure that it's right, I guess.
100%. And also it's if you really want to drive more adoption of health technology, which I think we're very, very, very early on, it needs to be safe and it needs to be effective, and otherwise you lose trust, and the technology, the adoption of the technology slows down. And so I think that, like, trust is very, very important. And essentially, in many ways, we see Scarlett as a business that is essentially in the trust business. And trust is, as you know, is hard to build and easy to destroy. And so you have to, we work incredibly hard to make sure that we do the right things and we do them effectively, because we think that there's also there is what I call like safety and availability, right? There is something, if you take the example of a product that is, let's say a product that's CE marked, it's out there, and the manufacturer's got, a great change that they can make to that product, and they have confidence that product, that change is actually going to, improve accuracy, let's say, for example, improve some statistics. It's actually unsafe for V2 to not be out there and to people be using V1, right? And so it's actually that's why it's important that the availability of the latest technology safely is critical. And it's not just about like making things faster and moving. I would never say that Scarlett removes red tape. It's not about that. But it's about making sure that the safe technologies get to the right people as fast as possible.
So that's a really interesting point. So what do you think about this narrative that's going on in the US at the minute around like deregulation being an answer? And I'm not saying that specifically they've talked about health tech, but we know with the government that's just come in, and the Department of Government Efficiency and this attack on government spending, and the definitely the anti-innovation, etc., all this regulations getting in the way. He's talked about it a lot with getting people to Mars. Why am I getting regulated so heavily to stop us becoming a multiplanetary species? But I mean, you can apply this. Leadership is a thing. I'm sure we're going to talk about it. We can, at least at some point today, that if you're setting that as your coordinates, if that's what you're saying that your values are as a leadership, that's going to seep into other sectors. And so that mindset of deregulation being an answer could find its way into health tech on that side of the pond. So do you find that dangerous? Are you worried about what's going on in the US?
Do you want to take a guess as to who's the first country in the world to have introduced medical device regulation?
Interesting.
It's the US.
Yeah.
Like in 1975, there was a medical scandal around the Darcon shields, which were, I think, IUT devices that were used by women, and there was like they were poorly designed, and I think thousands of people were impacted. And the year after, the US is actually very quick to regulate. The year after, they introduced the first piece of medical device regulation, and I think so the way that I see it is, I think that view, like that this idea of deregulation is, I think it's kind of irrelevant, because I think it's very short term, it's like a very short termist, very myopic view. I think the reality is that if you believe that a technology is impactful, inherently that technology has risks, right? Like airplanes are amazing. We get around the world in 24 hours, but they're amazing because they're also dangerous. Lifts are amazing. They get you from floor 8 to 1 in 30 seconds, but they're also dangerous, right? And you have to be able to protect humans in order to be able to drive adoption of technology in any area. And so I think this idea of deregulation, like, I see that as like a blip, because if you play it out, the way I see it is people deregulate, which I don't really think will happen in kind of the CDRH, which is the part of the FDA, which is around devices. I think it's more of a farmer and food problem that they seem to be interested in. And but even if they did, if we want to speculate down what that looks like, I think they deregulate more devices that can cause more harm or inherently out there. They have benefits as well, but it's inevitable that at some point there is a large incident, and you can look at the US and like a Darcon shield type incident, and then trust me, the US will be the first to turn around and be like, okay, let's not do that. And so I don't know. I take the long term view. I'm very what we're building at Scarlett is we want to build an organization where like the GE and the Johnson & Johnson of this century will be built on top of, and if you have to take that perspective, then like these kinds of things become less relevant, I think.
You mentioned Babylon as part of your story. It's interesting because we've had quite a lot of people from Babylon on the podcast, and we've talked about that story a lot on here, so I'm not going to get you to recount a lot of that stuff. I do just want to say, though, it's another example of very good hiring on their side and another example of another innovation that's popped out as a result. And that's not glamorizing, the demise of Babylon or anything up there. But I have relatively publicly asked Ali for an interview on this podcast, so it's another plug to get him back on to talk about it. But it is just interesting to me that people that have seen that style of innovation and disruption, two more people that have gone and started a company, which I think is interesting. And I don't know if you've just got a comment on that about how innovative was it? Was it part of was it literally just meeting Jamie, or was it being part of that environment that's given you some confidence to become an entrepreneur?
I would say most of it is meeting Jamie, and I think finding somebody who I think is an amazing sparring partner, and I think Jamie and I, he's on paternity leave now for a couple of weeks, but I think otherwise Jamie and I would say on average probably have spent 30 minutes a day together every day for the last 4 years.
Nice.
And I think that you have to have a pretty special relationship, and to be able to do that. I don't need to tell you that, but
No,
I think on Babylon, like it's a very complicated, multifaceted story, is what I think. I think there's a lot of bad stuff and good stuff, and I think that my experience of Babylon was, I think it was a good one, because obviously I encountered the problem that that was the genesis and the seed for what Scarlett does. So obviously, in many ways, I'm very thankful for Babylon, because without it, I wouldn't have met Jamie, and wouldn't have but I think that like it was a there was just a huge amount of money injected into a business that had to that ended up growing very quickly. And I think that if I had to pick one thing that, from my perspective, and I think the perspective of different people is very different, depending on which team you're in and so on. But from my perspective, I think one of the learnings was is just focus, which is so hard, right? And I think when you got the scale of like you got so much money coming in and you're growing so quickly, it's just so hard to be able to. And you have to, but I think it's the ones that are successful in that kind of blitz scaling phase, it seems to be the ones that somehow are able to remain ruthlessly, and I really mean ruthlessly, focused on the things that matter. And I think that, that's very, very hard to do. And I think Babylon struggled with that.
Mm. So when you started Scarlett and discussed this idea with Jamie, how much did you know about business before you started one?
Zero. I do not count reading 0 to 1 as knowing about business.
Which is a great little book, and fills you with all this optimism. And someone said it to me the other day. I think they heard it on a podcast or something, that you get the same dopamine hit talking about starting a business as you do actually starting it. So it's one of those things. Reading about it's probably just one stage removed from that. So you're getting definitely, because I can remember reading 0 to 1 and just feeling just so energized by it, and like, that, and the $100 startup was another one, and like all of these books, and I'm like, I'm going to do this one day. And you picture yourself, and you're getting all this up in your head about it. It's great, but it's interesting you say that you don't count reading about it at all.
I mean, I love to read. I definitely have read more business books since starting Scarlett. I think one that actually Jamie got me onto. I think Jamie's quite keen in general on like completing an author, and I think one author that I think he has completed is Clayton Christensen, who is a professor at Harvard Business School. He's quite a famous kind of business academic. He's more of an academic than, he had his own consulting firm, which I think is still going. But I think his work, and I guess his most famous piece of work is what's called The Innovator's Dilemma. But he's done a whole bunch of work, and that's definitely maybe the business like reading I've done that I think I've enjoyed the most. But there's definitely a lot of business books out there. But I like to vary my reading. I like to read a bit of everything. I'm reading kind of Ben McIntyre's The Siege at the moment, around the Iranian embassy siege. I'm reading a really interesting book as well from Stripe Press on it's called Poor Charlie's Almanac, and it's about Charlie Munger and kind of a selection of his talks. And so I think that like diversity in what you read is I don't know, it all contributes somehow, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're all multifaceted individuals with various interests, and I think Another thing that I heard the other day is that if someone's over your shoulder and they look at your YouTube feed or your TikTok feed, it's like, it feels like an intrusion of your privacy, because like that's a very real look into your into what you actually find interesting. So yes,
I can confirm it's just golf, chess, and probably some like startup podcast or something. Like,
literally. I mean, that's quite similar. That's quite similar to my feed. Do you play a lot of chess?
Not a lot. I kind of play on weekends. It's one of the things I kind of relax.
Do you have an elo that you're willing to share?
I think my highest, it's pretty bad. I think it's maybe like in rapid. I think I'm like 800 or something. So nothing. I'm not breaking it down.
To me, man. I'm trying to break 1,000.
I think I could definitely I just think that like I just have time to commit to it, and I think there's moments where like I get quite annoyed when I like blunder or something, and I'm like,
same.
And I think the challenge with chess is because I think culturally it's a sport that's always been so associated with intellect.
Yes.
And to an extent it is, but to an extent it's not. And obviously that would be a very, very narrow definition of intellect. But I think that a lot of people, and I will admit that I've been a victim of that. It's like people associate like, oh, I blundered, therefore I'm stupid.
Yeah.
And I think that like, I don't think that's how it works, obviously, but that has been my sense at times. I'm like, okay, like I don't really feel right now like feeling stupid about this thing. But I thought at some point about joining like a chess club, so you can actually play over the table with real people and get more into like the community that is chess rather than just a game and playing kind of, unknown people on the internet. But I think it's a fun game.
I think there are a lot of parallels with chess and other sports and even business at times as well, because like you're quite right, making a blunder on the chessboard, it's quite similar to making a blunder in a business. Like you could have seen it coming if you were able to see it coming. But the thing is with chess, I think there's a lot the same as running a business. A lot of it is actually experience. It's knowing like where the pieces feel right. Like knowing that the right pieces are on the right squares is often more of a feeling than it is very technically, I need my bishop here, I need the pawn defending it, I need to castle here. Advancing this pawn makes it look a bit weak and feel a bit weak. That is far more I think of what good chess players are good at, and they'll talk more in conceptual. Like Magnus the other day, like #1 chess player in the world, like greatest of all time, like for people that might not know, even he said like relatively recently that he started to think differently about king safety. Like that's not playing, an E4 start rather than a D4 start. Like they're talking about concepts, and I think that's similar to business. And I love what you just said about like, you're trying not to let yourself associate it with intellect or beating yourself up. I think it's the same making business mistakes. It's the same making hiring mistakes. Hiring is really similar. Like I don't think you can really attach your ego to hiring. Again, I've heard that somewhere. Like, I think it's a really good thing because you're just going to beat yourself up. If you blunder in hiring, same as you blunder a piece, you just keep going. You just keep going. Like, it just is what it is. You might now notice that same thing next time that, oh, why are they putting that piece there? Why have they said that thing in that interview? Like, maybe that means something later down the line. It's checkmate in 2. Like, fine, I know that in hiring. I know that if they're going to say that thing, I need to explore it or do that the same thing next time or different thing next time. So I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot that's similar, and not tying your business mistakes to intellect, I think, is very, very, very important. It's far more about experience and your tenacity and all the rest of it.
So are you admitting that if you blunder your queen, you keep playing and you're not just rage quitting immediately?
Of course, I've rage. Of course, generally, I rage quit because I'm a human. I'm imperfect. And of course I attach it to intellect, and of course I beat myself up. And if I lose a few in a row, like my elo is 100 points down right now than it was like a few weeks ago. And you'll know how many chess games you've got to lose in a row to lose 100 points. Like that's a pretty significant attack on my own sense of self. But it's funny, man. We did some filming for a client the other day with Johnny Wilkinson, and it was a mental health client, and he was and I play a lot of tennis, and I was asking him about like failure, and it's just something we talk about in business all the time, like failure. And he was talking to me about playing tennis and like, is there anything you struggle with and all that side of things. And I said I struggle with like often if I'm beating people really badly, I'll actually take my foot off the gas because I'll sort of feel sorry for them, and then I don't want them to pity me and all that sort of stuff. And he said, no, the humiliation is the gift. The humiliation is the gift, because it's that humiliation that will make someone change. I feel that way in chess right now. It's like losing so many in a row, and similarly in business, you know, making mistakes, having to fire people, having to, you know, extend probation of her, like all these different things is like, that is the gift, because you feeling the pain of the mistake that you make is what motivates you to put something in place so it doesn't happen next time. You know, blundering your queen 3 times in a row is going to make you go and learn an opening. It's going to make you go and learn a defense with black. It's going to make you go and do something slightly differently if you feel humiliated. I think that, and it was such a good, like that one phrase has just stuck with me, that the humiliation is the gift. And like, I definitely feel it because I beat myself up more than anyone else. I don't know if you're the same, but like, especially with a business mistake, you know, taking on a client that had red flags in the new business process, you take them on, they make, you know, the team's life a misery, and you're like, damn it, like I knew, and I'll beat myself up about it so much, but then it forces me to then do the work. Okay, I need to note these red flags. I need to make sure that we don't do this next time, and it is motivating. So humiliation is the gift, man.
Yeah, I think humiliation, like, well, framing as humiliation, I think is a bit tough on tough on yourself. I would say. I think that like falling over, let's put it that way, along the journey, I think is very normal, and I think like I think you have to be much more like you were talking about earlier as well. Like I think much more in love with the process rather than like the finish line or any kind. And so like if along the process, you know, you fall over, I think that's just like par for the course. And I think you have to be much more like. I think if you're in love with learning, then it's fine. It's like, oh, that's an interesting learning. Like that was interesting. And I think if it's like I think it's much more. There was a great line from a book that I have been reading. I think it's the Practical Guide to Stoicism or something like that. It's like from an American academic called Andrew Farnsworth. And anyways, the way he organizes his books are super interesting. He's got a really interesting book on English rhetoric as well. And but in this book, he basically like tackles the different topics of Stoicism, and what he does is that he then finds interesting extracts from authors, not necessarily kind of, you know, Stoics in kind of antiquity, but also, you know, more modern uses of, you know, these concepts in more modern literature, or, you know, and so on. And there was a great line, which actually Jamie's the one who originally pointed me to that book, which was it's a line from Hamlet, which goes, you know, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And I think that, like, you know, we actually in some of our team events like a year ago, we put it on the board, and I think it's very true, right? So I think to your point is like, oh, you make a hiring mistake, like, is that good, is that bad? Actually, it's whatever you think about it is how it's going to be, right? And I think that, you know, you can see the same event. I think it's harder work, if I'm honest, but you can see the same event as a gift. Wow, that was really interesting. I learned this about this type of customer, or this type of you know, answer to this interview question that, you know, and I've done it, like, you know, I've, you know, had a bad reference for somebody and still hired them and then been burnt by it. And I'm like, okay, so either you can look at that and be like, well, that's a stupid mistake. You could have just, you know, you get a bad reference, that's just a no-go, right? Or you can say, oh, that's a nice gift, you know? Like, I'm thankful for that learning. And I think you have the choice between the two, I guess is what I'm saying. And yeah.
That's nice, man. So we got distracted. Zero business knowledge and starting a business is a really, really interesting. I say zero business knowledge. You've read things, you know, first principles. You've been in the workplace. There's lots of analogs, I think, to business knowledge, because ultimately, what is business knowledge? And that's a funny one, because my nephew, relatively recently, was talking about starting a business and just had this idea for this concept, and basically just described, it took him ages to explain it, but basically just described affiliate marketing. And he just got there from first principles of like, well, what if this, and this, and then this happens, and then we get money this way, and just described affiliate marketing. Then he described equity funding in almost a textbook definition of it. And so but that was a really interesting thing to happen for me, because it's so interesting when people talk about business knowledge or doing an MBA, like all these different things. You can have these things pointed out to you, but ultimately there's a style of like first principles thinking that will just get you a really long way in starting a business. And so I don't know, what do you say to the people that are in that same boat? They've not started business before and they're looking to get experience, or maybe like, they've got an idea, but then don't necessarily have the confidence to start a business, like go on Companies House and do all that sort of stuff. Feels like a big deal, and a bank account and all that sort of stuff. But seemingly you walk that path. So like, what's your recollection of those really early days and that getting that start? Did you start more about the practicality, technical stuff, or were you more like model, what if these people paid us to do this thing, like, or this is the problem to solve? Like, how did you think about that kind of early bit to go from 0 to 1, to coin a phrase?
Yeah, I think that like all I can talk about is my experience, and I think like one big part of the answer to that question, if I'm honest, is that when Jamie and I were like, okay, let's leave Babylon and start Scarlet. What we did was I was like it was the middle of COVID. We knew zero about business, and also we had this bias, which I think is wrong, in hindsight. But we had this bias, which was we're both very technical people, and we had technical roles, and there isn't somebody with kind of the MBA from Harvard in the team, kind of thing. And so what we did is that actually before going to Imperial, I actually interned at a company that went through Entrepreneur First (EF), and so I told Jamie, I was like, hey, like what if we went, like we applied to this thing called EF, and I think it'll give us some structure. It's the middle of COVID, like we'll have some structure, and somebody will ask us the question like, what is a business, right? and so we both applied, and I think it's interesting because it's another, there's so much luck in the story of any kind of company, and we're still so early, but it's like we both got in, and I think they only accept you as an individual rather than a pair, so they didn't care that they thought that we would just like pair up with other people, or even though we said we'd pair together. So I think the odds of both of us getting in were pretty slim. And but we went through that. So we just paired up on the first day. We never went through the kind of speed dating phase of the incubator. But I think a big part of answering that question for us was going through EF. And I think it's been a very valuable program for us. Obviously, our experience of it is quite different because we knew each other.
Yeah.
But what it means is that I think very early on we had two advisors. One is Patty Stobbs, who's a founder, who's just found a new business called StackFix, and another one was Charles Jolly, who is a Californian kind of US entrepreneur who sold a bunch of businesses to big tech, and he was very, very formative for us because I think he asked us like, there were maybe two ideas I think that like EF kind of tools that they gave us early on. One of them was, I remember Charles saying people don't buy vitamins, they buy painkillers. and I think that when we were kind of exploring and testing the ideas and pushing these things, he was like, people buy on pain, they don't buy on. And so I think that was one frame that I think was helpful to kind of, when we're doing like market discovery, if you will, and trying to like, our LinkedIn used to be like Christmas trees, and just trying to speak to as many people as possible, just to understand, more perspectives on the problem than just our own from Babylon. I think that was very helpful. And I think EF and Patty have this kind of other concept, which is like running into the spike is what they call it. And I think it's this idea that like whatever the thing you're most uncomfortable about your idea, about like whether people will pay for it, for example, or whether the market is big enough, or like whatever that thing is that's uncomfortable to you, like the spike, you just got to run at it, right? And I think generally that's uncomfortable. But I think that was very helpful early on because we'd have weekly calls with them, and every week they'd be like, okay, what have you done over the last week? And what are your biggest concerns, and making sure that like whatever that concern was, a week later you'd worked as hard as you could to resolve it. And I think that like early on, I think those were helpful frameworks for us to make progress. And also so yeah, I think those are the two that come to mind.
And in terms of growing that company, then I mean, did you have an idea? Because Entrepreneur First is great because from what I know about the program, you have the sort of immediate problem solved of how am I going to survive with a stipend. So as you go through the problem, as you go through the program, you're at least covering costs, or at least you're slowing down the rate at which you're eating into your savings, because it's probably not a huge amount. So you get that bit solved. it's a big step to jump out of a career to go and then do that. I suppose knowing that what you've got is skill based, you can always, go back and do different things and that kind of thing. So there's some element of security there. But I imagine like the race is on to build some sort of business model to either get revenue or to raise money. So interestingly, with like your business, like which way were you? What were you thinking? Like we just need, is raising money the first step, or is getting a customer the first step? Like how did you think about the business as you were growing it?
Yeah. So like Scala in many ways is like the opposite of like the lean startup.
Yeah.
It's like we have a very, very big MVP, right? Like our MVP is, become a notified body, and which is very hard.
Exactly.
And
it doesn't sound like a cheap thing to do.
It's not cheap. It takes time. It's difficult. It's even more difficult if you're starting from nothing, where the whole big part of all of the approval is proving to the regulators that you've got things, whether that is processes or talent or insurance and so on. And I think that and so we needed to raise money in order to start that. And I think that I find and often people talk about deep tech businesses. I've often kind of presented Scala as like a deep regulatory business where you have to go and do quite a lot of work up front to be able to build the capability that can then deliver on the value proposition. And so I think for us it was very much the latter of having to raise money in order to be able to get started. And I think that that's very different from what 0 to 1 will tell you, which is build something, get into the hands of users, and ship. And I think that like now we're in a phase where we can be more like that, because now we can we can deliver on the very proposition. And so now it's important that we move as a team. We move very, very quickly towards shipping improvements and a better experience for customers and so on.
So I want to talk about notified bodies as a business. I'm interested in what the business model is here, because you've talked at the beginning as a notified body, you're wanting to do things slightly differently. You're wanting to do things differently. You're wanting to assess devices, software, etc., or like fit in a fit for purpose way, which is partly your differentiator in the market. So who do you answer to on your processes, first of all? That's what I'm interested in.
So in the UK, it's the MHRA, so it's the health regulator in the UK, and they're the people who regulate, or in the UK they're called approved bodies, but it's the same thing. And then in Europe, you have to go through you have to go through a member state. In our case, we go through the Netherlands, and so it's the same same competent authorities. That's what it's called as some of the biggest notified bodies like the BSI, and so they're the entities that regulate us. And then in their case, it's them and also the European Commission.
And what exactly do you need to prove to them?
I think that like the easiest way to answer this is Annex 7 of MDR sets out the requirements for notified bodies, and fundamentally there are 4 sections. I won't let you read. I won't tell you have to go and read the kind of the 50 pages or however long that annex is, because there's also guidance and so on. But I think that the short version, the TLDR, is there are 4 sections that regulators care about. One is around organizational, like who are you as an organization? Who are you as a company, your legal structure and things like that. 2 is obviously what's called your quality your management system. So obviously, as we know, we have to have a very robust and very large management system in order to obviously make sure that the way that we run our processes is audited by ourselves, and management reviews and so on and so forth. The third section is around competence. So it's showing to the regulator that you got like the people who have the required expertise and training in order to be able to do assessments. And the fourth one, which is probably the largest in terms of requirements, is what's called process requirements. And so that's really like, how do you actually document and record how you do an assessment, and how do you do like decisions, and how do you, and so on and so forth. And really those are the 4 areas.
So they mainly point to the how. They don't point to the what, which I think is interesting, which is, I guess, what's giving you the freedom to assess things differently. Now, I'm sure there's obviously going to be things that you have to assess, but seemingly in order to give you that differentiation, there's a degree of freedom in what you assess, and I suppose how you assess it downstream of that?
We assess the same information as any other notified body. I think that and we have to assess the same information. I think that what we do is that we ask customers, then they use a piece of software that we've built to be able to organize their information and submit it in a way that is more effective for us to review.
I see.
And so in a traditional system, it's much more like, share with me your technical file in a way that is, an attachment in an email, and it's kind of, a zip file containing a folder structure, which is, generally, obviously each notified body have their own processes. There's actually more variability than people think, but is organized in whichever way the manufacturer wants to organize it. Is based on their competences, based on their expertise, based on many things. And actually, that's one of the big challenges, I think, for notified bodies, because obviously people talk about time to market and the fact that notified bodies are slow and so on. But I think one thing to recognize, to kind of, be able to speak up for being on the other side of the kind of on the receiving end of that is, notified, like, to be able to build it, just like generally as a business, to be able to build more efficient processes and to be able to make things better, you need to have consistency, right? And if every single time that you receive a submission, it is completely different, it's always going to be very different in terms of, obviously it's a different application and a different medical specialty, and so the data that you receive is obviously very different every time. But if the format in which you receive it is also very different every single time, you can imagine how, it becomes completely bespoke every time. And so with Scarlett, by having a narrow scope of designation and by having, to focus purely on software and AI devices, what it means is that we can be not completely structured, but there is more structure that we can include in terms of how we want people to organize the information. So they have their own, it is a manufacturer's responsibility to be compliant with the requirements, and they have to share the evidence with us that we request in order for us to be able to do our assessments and to see whether they conform the requirements or not. And if they do, or if they don't, and they've resolved it, then we can make our decision. But I think a lot of it is around, we ask for the same information, and in many ways, from having done our surveillance audits with our competent authority, we're like very, very thorough. and the reason that we're able to be very thorough and fast in our assessment is because we're able to organize the information in a way that or the manufacturer organizes their information in a way that is we think optimal in terms of, or working towards optimal. We're always kind of improving it towards being able to do a safe assessment faster, and also in a way that is set up so that once we, let's say we make a positive decision, that device, when they want to come with V2 and V3 and V4, it's more effective for us to be able to review it rather than re-receiving, another hundreds of pages of PDF, and it takes time for us to review. And so I think that, like, that structure, and by the way, like, it's not, we've implemented our own version of it, but it's not a new idea. Like, the US have what's called now the eStar program, which is not their program anymore. It's called the eStar submission form, but essentially the short version there, it's their own version of, if you want to apply for a 510K, or I think even de novo PMA, and many of their pathways towards getting a device approved or cleared, you have to use this structured PDF they have. It's like a smart PDF, if you will. And, Scala is more detailed than that, but you can see that this notion, and even MDCG, which is the kind of European body that generates guidance for medical device regulation, just published a piece of guidance around this idea of, that more structure is needed in that process. And so I think that we do it, and I think it's just easier to do when you have a narrow scope, if that makes sense, and you have a specialty and you have that expertise.
Yeah, because this is something that's talked about in software a lot, isn't it? That this frustration, that the volume of the work for submission just for a small update is kind of crushing the ability to be as agile as you need to be in order to be competitive in the market. And so that's one example of where people on the regulatory side of the table, like yourselves, have a role to play in just how good we are as a nation at innovating in health tech, specifically in this example. And so again, it comes down to, like, in part, there's duty, and it's good that, competition can be created, and actually, an incentive can be created to form a company like yours and build a business model around it, because it does make everything better and quicker and safer and all the rest of it. But where do you think we are in the UK right now in terms of that ecosystem, in terms of this stuff? And frankly, just the speed, looking at all the AI stuff and everyone's skinning ChatGPT to do something or other in the healthcare space. So are we set up for this? Is that ecosystem set up for this? Are you guys set up to receive all of these applications and get all this stuff done and mass rejection, select all and hit no, or select all and hit yes? I don't know.
No, we're very well set up, and I think that the vast majority of our customers build AI devices. I've talked to a lot of people that want to do an LLM as a medical device, and that's maybe a separate topic. We've not approved any of those yet. We've not even received an application for one.
Interesting.
But obviously, I've spoken to a lot of people. I mean, again, it's very possible that another notified body is processing one and we wouldn't know.
And do they quickly, would that set any precedent in any way, or does that still mean that every notified body would act individually?
Every notified body would act individually.
Yeah, okay,
so I think in MDR there's a notion of equivalence, but it's much stricter than in the idea of in the US you have the 510K and the idea of a predicate device.
Yeah.
And so in the US I think if the FDA, let's say they approve under some kind of pathway an LM as a medical device, then somebody else could 510K and use it as a predicate if it makes sense. And you can do that in Europe, but it's much harder to claim equivalence. That's TBD. But each notified body, you have to make their own decision. And when it comes to the UK, I mean, look, I think the UK is in a very unique and kind of once in a generation position, which is that they've obviously separated from Europe. It's taken time. The current rules in the UK are still the old European ones, and they're kind of in this kind of limbo state where they're about to move to the new ones. And when I say about to move is that I think the first piece, which was around post-market surveillance, I think has already been put in front of the Commons, and I think there's other parts of the regulations which are we've gone through the consultations and are going to be coming out in 2025. And obviously in that model, the UK is can do whatever it wants, if you said, it's not, and I think that the couple of things that are interesting there is there's the AI Airlock program, which I think the first cohort was published by the MHRA yesterday. So this is a kind of a program run by the MHRA to help very innovative AI devices kind of be put in a sandbox in a specific deployment and kind of in a contained environment in order to see how they perform. They monitor before so they can generate clinical data to be able to support their approval. So that's one, I think, interesting initiative that is only possible in this new paradigm. And I think the other one is I think the MHRA I think is doing a good job of being self-aware. And what I mean by that is the UK is only 4% of the global healthcare market. And so if the UK moves to a model where you have to get an EU MDR style approval, the same amount of there's no you have to get an approval that is equivalent in time and investment as in 510K or let's say a EU MDR, then the best devices will not come to the UK population and will not come to the people who need it in this country. And so the UK knows that, and so what they've presented is what they call international reliance, and essentially it's a legal framework that's part of the new medical device regulation that essentially says that certain types of devices that have already approvals in other jurisdictions, the biggest one being EU MDR, having European approval, can go still through an approval process with an approved body like Scarlett in the UK, but that approval process is more targeted and is faster, so that you don't have to reprove everything again, if you see what I mean. And that I think is generally a good idea, because I think that it obviously means that technology that is available in one place can come to somewhere else, and I think that the UK has some self-awareness in how it's drafting those new rules.
Do you see the day where an LLM gets approved as a medical device 100%. In their current state?
Yes, I think so. Yes,
you do.
100%. I think that it's Like, the thing that people have to recognize, and if you go on, okay, maybe the mega regulatory nerds will do this, but if you go onto the UK government website, if you search UK approved bodies medical devices, and you click on like not Scarlet because we only do software, but if you go to like the BSI or some other notified body, you'll see that the range of medical technology that gets approved and that range of technology that falls within medical device regulation is so wide. Like, you've got like everything that you find in a hospital, everything that you probably might find in like a care home. There's all the kind of direct to consumer products, like over the counter stuff at Boots. Like, the range of technologies that fall within medical device regulation is really wide. And I think the assumption that this new technology, which is slightly different, it is, but only slightly different, somehow doesn't fit into the framework that fits for hundreds of different technologies, I think is wrong. And I think you have to be more first principled about it. And I think that what's more likely to happen is, like, as far as I can see, nobody's yet like tried to go and get try to apply MDR, the requirements of MDR to an LM as a medical device and see what happens. It's possible that it breaks, specifically in risk management, and I think that, like, and then that person, but you have to try, because then what happens is then you try, and then we know about it, and then we do, which we know, we work a lot with the people that regulate Scarlet, because they want to hear what's happening in the market, and we can work with them towards drafting guidance that says, okay, well, when it comes to this specific technology, let's interpret these things in this way, right? But it's very hard to do that unless you have like a real life example.
It's interesting because people talk about the the areas that it would fall down on, things like the black box nature, the lack of determinism. Like, it's not deterministic. You ask it the same thing twice, it's going to give you two separate answers or do two different things. Like, these are the is there anything that you like? Where are the areas that you think it might fall down on?
I mean, the black box is not an issue. Like, there are currently hundreds of computer vision applications that have been C marked Class 2A, Class 2B,
right,
that use convolutional neural networks.
Right.
Those are black box models.
Yeah.
And, as far as I can, radiology is a huge space for AI in healthcare. And as far as I can see, that those products are built by the largest medical device manufacturers in the world. They're used by millions of people very successfully. So black box, not an issue. I think the determinism is more the issue. And again, like I can't tell people what to do, and that's not our role in the industry. But I think that, like, people need to find a way of mitigating that risk, and I to assume that it's non-mitigatable, I think is wrong. And I think that I think people need to be able to mitigate it, and as well, it's also important to understand that there's this idea of, like, a benefit risk analysis, right? And it is the responsibility of the manufacturer to reduce the risk as far as possible. But you, as a clinician, you've used hundreds of devices during your career, where even though they're safe devices, they have inherent risks, right? But the idea is then that the benefits outweigh those risks, and it's up to the manufacturer to make those estimation and to prove that to notified bodies, or if they want access here. But somebody's got to do it, if you see what I mean. And I spoke to a lot of people that are thinking about it, and we talked about it. I'm hopeful that Scarlet will be one of the first people to be able to do it. I think that'll be super exciting. But I think that's how innovation happens.
Yeah, I think that the benefit versus risk thing, I think is such a good point, because I think this is where the ethical argument actually gets really interesting. When we're going at such a rapid pace, large language models can be deployed in so many different ways, doing so many different things. And you look at the co-pilots; they're in clinical spaces doing things. So there's going to be a lot of catch up that's going to have to be made if we're going to reverse some of those decisions that have already been taken globally. And so I do think you're right. I think it comes to a point of, like, ethically speaking, like, is it ethical to prevent these things coming to market when there's so much potential benefit? And I think there's work to do on declaring quite specifically what all of that benefit actually is, rather than in quite a nebulous way. Everyone's like, well, it can be used for everything, so therefore it can do anything. And as you know, that's always a very dangerous argument to make without the specifics. But it does feel like that. It feels like we've got this new tool that could potentially do anything, and therefore it could do everything. But I think once we can quantify that potential benefit, I think that ethical argument can then be made around, like, okay, then what are the risks? And I do think What's interesting is intended use. I think that's ultimately where things get really, really interesting here, because we've got this big, like huge amount of things it could do, ranging from the absolutely necessary and would make absolutely enormous impact to kind of nice to have, would improve a few things for a few people. We can start at one extreme end of that with this potentially. We can, and we can go, well, how about we just look at it in this really, really, really narrow intended use here and get comfortable over time and expand out of there. I think where the argument starts to fall down is, I think people equate large language models as a medical device more to, oh, it's going to be them
To do
blanket everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. I think that's where it falls down. And I think where I'd like it to be is, here's the thing, right? A bit of a story. So I was saying, I had an argument for a little while. Basically, large language models shouldn't be placed at the point of human suffering alone, because that redefines us as humans and what we declare is okay. Putting someone, for mental health triage or for talking therapy or like all of these that, like putting it there, I just didn't like the thought of it there being a clinician by background. But then the argument got, you put something like that out there in the public, you get a lot of arguments back. And the arguments were like, well, what if there's nothing? Something is better than nothing. And that's an argument. But again, the most compelling argument was sort of what I just said, of like, making blanket statements is not progressive. The difficult, more nuanced thing to do is what about if you try to really consider where it might be useful and safe on balance? And like, then you go to the more extreme ends of that. So rather than saying, okay, it should never be used in talking therapy, well, what if it was for this condition in this scenario, if they've been waiting this long with no chance of getting seen for this amount of time, with this risk to them and others and property, you can analyze the risk to go, well, now we've got a risk assessment of an LLM, we've got a risk assessment of this situation. So in this exact situation on balance, if we were to play this out, I think it's best to use it here. I think that's where it becomes quite interesting, but very, very, very nuanced.
Yeah, and by the way, I think this argument holds for any medical device.
Yeah, right.
I think that even non-LLM based devices that try and do everything, because I think the problem is that you have to be able to prove with clinical data that you can, back your claims. And if your claims are everything, then you have to have, I guess, in theory, an infinite amount of data, right? So I think that I think that argument holds in general.
Yeah, it's fascinating, man. I know we're running out of time. There's one more question that I wanted to ask you. Based on where you are in our health tech ecosystem, what is exciting for you? What are you getting excited by right now? That could be a device. It could be something to do with the policy around what you guys are doing, or do you see a change coming in some way? I'm interested.
I'm always excited about like people building like the most ambitious businesses possible in healthcare. And I think one way, I think the kind of companies that are building kind of the full stack, I think which obviously is far more expensive. I think it's super interesting. People who are like, I deliver care, I monitor patients, I have the doctors, I've got the premises, I've got the technology. And, I guess Neko Health is an example of that. There are a few other ones, but I think that those businesses generally are like, I find that exciting because I think that because obviously, I think that there are, time to market and predictability of certification. What we do is, I think, is a very important part of the infrastructure towards, enabling technologies to get to patients, but it's not the only one, right? And obviously the challenges that we see, obviously that we, people see in the industry is, okay, now I need to commission into the NHS, right? I need to, and I'm sure you've had guests who are far more, eloquent about that topic than I am, but selling healthcare once you have it is also the next challenge, right? And it's not just the approvals is the kind of table stakes to be able to do that, but then there's the next stage. And I think that healthcare businesses that can just don't not have to do that because it's themselves is always interesting. So that's another thing I think is exciting in general. I think another thing that I get excited about is companies that you wouldn't think are building healthcare technology that are actually building it, right? And so I'll give you a couple examples. It's like Apple, shipped their new AirPods a couple months ago, and in it is a hearing aid, and that actually has been 510K as a software as a medical device, right? And so now you got like, it's kind of breaking this classical model of you got medical device manufacturers, your Medtronics and your GE, and then you got your big technology companies that build, consumer hardware and so on. And those lines are getting blurrier and blurrier. And so, you got, Apple's doing that, or, Meta have, software medical device compliance, team. Google have quite a big, Google Health has a pretty big regulatory affairs team. And I think that's on the side of, big tech. But you can also look on the side of pharma, and you'll find that Novo Nordisk and the Roches and those organizations are also building regulatory affairs, like in compliance teams in the digital healthcare space, if you will. And I think that's interesting because I think that like one of the as software has become more and more commoditized, and it's cheaper to be able to build software, and also if there is a faster way of getting to market safely. My view is that if you speak to any company that is in the healthcare space, medical device or not, and you ask them to describe, forget about regulation, and ask them to describe what is the most ambitious version of your product in terms of what would be most impactful for your users. And almost unanimously, there's something in there that is about diagnosing, monitoring, treating, prescribing any kind of condition or any kind of disease. And that's a medical device, right? And so in many ways, I think that like the most ambitious version of like any business that touches people's health is building a digital healthcare solution. And I think that's starting to be true. And you can see it with, consumer companies like Apple, but I think that's just the beginning. And I find that quite exciting because it means that it also makes the healthcare space more competitive. Consumers have more choice of, I don't know, let's take the hearing aid market. It's like, okay, well now there's a very powerful business in Apple that's now shipped a product. Like that's probably going to improve the hearing aids that people get, right? Yeah. And so I think that like that kind of cross-pollination across industries is very exciting.
I love
very
that.
exciting for people.
I love that. I was getting fired up you talking about that because I think you're right that the ambition is it's a really interesting word to say in a room of people that have health tech companies, because ultimately we're all either scientists or we're from or medics, or we're from an evidence-based world. And so there's a real tension between an evidence-based background and wild ambition, especially in terms of how you communicate it. And I think that's one thing that scientists will always be fighting the urge to caveat everything that they're saying with some sort of evidence, and communicating ambition is never that. And it's interesting that what you said is like when you eventually quiz someone down, you'll find the ambitious point once you've quizzed them down, but it's interesting that they're never going to lead with it. And I think health tech might suffer because of that. I think there are a lot of ideas that stay on the shelf because of that. I think you have to go into an investor meeting and sell vision, and encouraging into my world now of like communication stuff. But like it's interesting to me that in an evidence-based world, I just wonder if your default mode of thinking is thinking in evidence-based terms, you're not moonshotting all the time. You're not thinking what if, or in that wild, ambitious way. I don't know. I don't know if that harms us.
I don't think that's like those two things are opposed. I think they can actually be, help each other. Like I remember reading a book called A Matter of the Heart, which is a history about heart surgery. And I was fascinated to read about the kind of things that heart surgeons were trying, especially during World War II, where there was a lot of field hospitals in Kent and on the South Coast, and patients would soldiers would be flown back from Europe, and surgeons would try and save their lives, and often try pretty radical stuff like replacing arteries with glass tubes type of ideas, but like that's where innovation happens, right? And those people obviously are the doctors themselves. And so I think that like it's not all of it worked, but like as somebody who actually had, you know, open heart surgery when I was born, you know, I benefited from that, right?
Wow.
And do I know that some people had challenges? You know, like did some people suffer because other people were trying new techniques and trying new treatments and trying new procedures? Yes, and like, but the idea is that the next generation or the next person benefits from it, and so I think you can be evidence based, and I think that is ambitious, right? But it's also evidence based, and so I don't actually think those two things are differ from each other. I think it's about like you know, doing it well and doing it ethically and you know, giving your best shot, and you know, if there are regulations, doing it the right way. And also maybe in the end, like taking a slightly more long-term view, right? I think people have too short-term of a view, and that leads them to thinking that, you know, ambition is in opposition to evidence-based. But I think the history of medicine will tell you otherwise, right?
Well, absolutely true. I remember Keith Grimes was on this podcast a while back, and we were talking about how excited we were about, you know, co-pilots coming out, and you know, one day you might not need to write notes. You've got the agent model that will then order all the bloods. All you need to do is then do the consultation. So maybe doctors in like hundreds of years' time, all they'll be doing is just having the consultation. And you just said, why do you need a consultation? It's like, why does there need to be a hospital? And why does it need to be? And it's like the AI can redefine, or not even AI, right? Just the advancement of technology can redefine everything. And actually getting into that mode of thinking of like, how would you reimagine everything? That sort of ambition of like, well, now I believe I can make that happen. Like that's interesting. That's interesting.
Definitely. And I think that innovation generally happens very, very slowly and then very quickly all at once. and so I think that generally when people look at LLMs and that whole conversation, which I think is interesting and it is a powerful technology, is people think that it's all going to happen now all at once. And I just don't think that's true. I think to your point, it starts with very targeted and niche successful applications that drive adoption. And then that's going to happen slowly. And then out of nowhere, you're not in consultations anymore, right? But I think it's not like someday we're going to wake up and it's going to be done. I think that it's much more continuous than that.
James, it's been a pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it. For people that want to learn more about you or Scarlett, or particularly anybody who wants to get in touch for regulatory reasons, what's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, James at scarlett.cc, you know, and that you can find me there. You can find me on LinkedIn, always happy to help. Always happy to chat.
Pleasure, dude. Thanks so much.